Captain Rusty Ball, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. First time I've read some of your stuff. Uh, nice to meet you.
You too, sir. Are you retired from the river? Are you medically restricted?
Well, right now with the medicine I take, I couldn't pass a drug test, so I'm not trying. I'm working on trying to get everything back, health wise. But it's killing me not being in the industry. I've been in the industry since I was 8 years old. Uh, and I don't know anything else. I've never been taught how to do anything else but run a boat and work. Uh, so I've got a new venture I'm trying to get started, but it's just so I can stay involved with the industry. And it's going out doing accident investigation. If the company or the Coast Guard or whoever hires me, I mean, I go out and I evaluate what happened, who the people were, what the conditions were, and I give the company or the person or the Coast Guard, whoever hires me, they're the only one who gets my results and of a no bull assessment of what happened. Because a lot of the companies, the people that are in the office and dispatchers like yourself have never been on a boat. And you don't really know whether the guy's telling you what actually happened. I've heard in my career, I've heard some real doozies out of people that, saying what they want to say to an office. And, uh, it's just a way for me to stay involved in the company. And it's not being a professional witness. I've done that before and it's fine, but I go out and investigate what actually happened and return it to that person, and they can do with whatever they want. And if they decide to use my, statements in court, I will go back my statements in court, as far as that goes. But it's just giving them a no bull assessment of what happened. Plus, it's a way for me to keep my fingers, in the pot, so to say. I don't know any other way of life but the river.
Well, let's start there then. What year was it that you first got involved, and kind of tell me the story of how you found yourself in this industry?
Well, Dad drugged me along with him, going out on the boats. My dad was a captain for Ashton Oil, and he just drugged me along with him, through the summers, the weekends. Uh, Whenever I was about 7 or 8, he quit line hauling and came into the harbor and took over the harbor at Catlettsburg. And I would go with him, and several people that I got to know as a child, they would kidnap me on the boat. They'd find out I was on the boat with Dad, and they'd ask Dad if I could come get on the boat with them for a while. And I had one good old guy that started a company. He took me to Nashville, and Dad was fit to be tied because he had kidnapped me and kept me for a week and a half. Uh, but that week and a half, I learned a lot. Uh, he was on a boat that didn't have flanking rudders, and he showed me how to flank Cincinnati bridges. And I was old enough and experienced enough to know that did not look good. But he taught me a lot. And it's
How
just the only thing I know. And then whenever I was 17, I graduated. And but it's just I went out at 17 and started working and just stayed there and went to Ashton Oil and worked for them. And then I worked for uh, Marty Boggs for 9 years there at Catlettsburg, in the harbor. And I got my license. Well, I was running the boat for him without a license. So I went and got my license. And uh, then I went to work for Amherst and then ACBL and then Trip for everyone I could. Uh, I think Ingram's probably the only people I've ever tripped for. Uh, but it just, uh, I just, all I ever wanted to do was be on a boat. It was kind of stupid. But it's the only place I was comfortable was sitting on a towboat.
How old were you the first time you got out on one?
Eight,
And what year would that have been?
around 65.
Okay. What do you remember most about getting out there the first time? I mean, I'm sure you heard things from your father over those first couple of years.
Watching watching Dad maneuver the boat, I thought that was so cool. It was a sea mule boat, had three sea mules, and watching him move uh, the toggles back and forth, and I would just sit there. I was amazed watching the boat move back and forth as he come down on a barge. As he put a face bar on and jerked the barge out. The first time he did that, I was just like, wow. He doesn't have the barge, but it's coming to him. And Dad just taught me to go do stuff the hard way because sooner or later that hard way is going to come up. And if you've already been doing it, it's not new. You're not going to be surprised. And to be that whatever you said on the radio, that you had to make sure that you said it forcefully and upright. And I can remember that big time. Him getting on me because I answered on the radio unsure. And he would just smack me upside the head and say, "That ain't the way to do that." And it's not being overbearing or uh, knowing too much. It's making sure that people understand that you can be trusted and you know what you're doing with them. And in that harbor, whenever something went wrong, Dad was the one that came in and took over and started giving orders. There's several times that someone's taken fleets out, and it's just a domino effect. And listening to Dad give orders and telling people what to do, and he was smart enough he'd turn around and tell me why, you know. And I just kept that in the back of my head my whole life that, and I got into those situations. And someone has to step up, be in charge. And it ain't that you're better than anyone else. Just someone has to be there to point the way for everyone else to do what has to be done. And that was one of the biggest things I took away from my dad uh, was that. And you don't show your nerves, you know, especially to the crew. It doesn't matter what's going on. You don't show that you're nervous. Once they leave the wheelhouse, you can go to your knees with, you're shaking. But as long as your crew's around, you keep yourself, strong. And I came up out of McAlpine Lock one time, and we'd been through there, I think, 6 times in 24 hours doing RTO, and it was when ACBL was running the overage and back and forth. And I went down, and it's about the fourth time, I think. And I faced up on a guy's overage, 15 loads, and I just told him to throw the face wires on. And like an idiot, I didn't put out long wires or anything because I'd been through there so many times. And just as I started clearing the canal and came ahead on it, my face wires broke. And I topped around completely. Uh, on that toe and turned it completely around and back up as they were getting me a wire on the other side. And the captain I was working with, old Ed Rudolph, he came up in the wheelhouse and he goes, "You want a cup of coffee?" Just real hateful. And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm going to make another pot." And I turned around with my coffee cup and I just shrunk, went to my knees. And, everything I'd just done came in on me. And he was looking down at me in the floor. He said, "Well, it's a good gosh darn thing that you were down there on the floor." He said, "Because I just watched you do something that no one else would ever do. And you're standing up there like you're sitting in a church pew." And I said, "Well, I've been taught that when stuff is going wrong, you just stick with it. Afterwards, you can let all the nerves, kick in." But I was laying on the floor looking up at him. My nerves and everything had finally just kicked in. But I don't know if you've ever seen it, that fountain that they have at Louisville between the bridges. I topped the toe around it. And it was spraying on the barges and then spraying on the boat as I shoved up out of there. And I don't ever want to do that again. It's not one of those things that you plan. But if you're taught to do stuff the hard way the first time, if you ever have to do it, it's not hard. But I've never been taught to tip 15 heavy loads around uh, in between the bridges at Louisville. Uh, but
Right.
it just, uh, I don't know. I get excited about the River Thames because it's the only thing I've known. Uh,
Right. Well, fill me in, I guess, on your father's career and where he came from, how he found himself in the industry.
uh, he had got released from the Navy after World War II in Norfolk, and he was hitchhiking home. And he came down at Normal there in Kentucky, uh, just above Ashland, Kentucky. It was called Normal, and Old Lock 29 sat there. And he was walking the rest of the way because that was all the farther that the train led him. Was Ashland. He had to walk all the way to Louisa. And he was walking out through there and he was watching this guy carrying groceries and putting on the boat. And he asked him, he said, "Is there any chance of getting a job?" And because Dad had a girlfriend and a baby, at his mom's that he'd never seen, and he knew he had to make money. And the old guy looked at him. He said, "Well, you got a sea bag?" He said, "Get on." And the old guy putting groceries on the boat was Paul Blazer, who founded Ashen Oil. And Dad started there at Old Lock 29, and just worked his way up. Uh, and from what the people have told me, Dad was one heck of a hand with a line and very, very good at decking, which people will argue with you, but the better you are at decking, the better you are in that wheelhouse. And Dad, Dad apparently was pretty good, and he's worked his way into the wheelhouse. And then he left the mine home, came into the harbor, uh, and he just took over that harbor. But he had, I think, it was 54 years with Ashen Oil, and he taught a lot of people. I mean, they might not have been on the boat with him. They might have been ones he hired, boats he hired, and he taught a lot of people uh, things. Uh, but if you were on the boat with him, he couldn't explain why. He'd just say, "Do it, just do it," and you did it, or you got smacked upside the head. He was. People talk about who they steered for. and how rough they were. And it's like you ain't never seen rough. Whenever you just are close to making a mistake and you get smacked out of the wheelhouse, you learn real quick that way. But that was he did that. He had no plans on me going to work on the river. Uh, but my graduation day, we got into it, and I knew the quickest way to get out from underneath his thumb was to go to work out there because I knew I could do it. I used to be able to get away from him when I would be out there on the boat. I would go out on deck with the guys in deck, and I knew I could deck. That was easy. I didn't have to think to do that. And but then, like I said, I was running a boat without a license and not getting paid for it. So I thought, if I'm going to get stuck here, I might as well make the money. And I had it in my mind I was going to move up and make money. And I did. And there was no place I ever worked that I couldn't go back to. I never messed up. I wasn't perfect, but I made sure that, you know, Dad always used to say, and Murdy Boggs did too. I spent a lot of time with Murdy, and they would tell you that your reputation is half of who you are. And if you're considered a liar or lazy, said you will never get rid of that. It'll follow you the rest of your career. So I made sure that I didn't have that in my mind anyway, Tim. Uh, but like I said, uh, I had a good teacher and a lot of others that working over there at Ashland Oil. I worked with some really good captains, Max English and Gene Dent. Uh, they taught me a lot just as being a deckhand on the boat with them and the way they acted. Gene Dent, every time you came off tow, he would swing the window up and he'd yell down, "Good job." And if we came back off tow and he didn't open that window and yell, "Good job," we sat in that doghouse and tried to figure out what we did wrong, you know. And that was his way of, you know, we would think it out where we didn't do something right. And that was Gene's way of teaching. And I enjoyed the heck out of working for Gene. Uh, but like I said, it's all I've ever known.
What were the working conditions on deck back in the mid 60s?
Uh, One guy in the harbor, it was one guy, doing everything. And up through the 70s, when I was decking over there at Boggs, it's one person. And ours was dinner bucket, and you brought something. They had a store that we were allowed $3 a day when I first started per person to pick up lunch meat or whatever you wanted to eat. And if you got a chance to make a sandwich, you made a sandwich. And we would always, if we went by the office, we'd swing in and grab a cup of coffee. But you worked. When you got several times when I got off work, I went out and crawled in my car or my truck and leaned the seat back and went to sleep because I didn't have it in me to be able to drive home. We worked one person building a 15 barge tub, and you were tired, really tired.
And were there, work vests, steel toe boots, gloves, all that stuff all back then?
Kinda. Uh, the steel toes, no. The work vest, we had them on the boat because the Coast Guard would inspect the tugs, but we never wore them. Certain places going into certain docks, like for Ashland Oil, we'd put one on because they required it coming into their docks. But no, we didn't. I fell in December 18th, in 79, and it was cold. And uh, all I could do was, paddle. I couldn't get my work boots to come off. And Dad was the only boat in the area that had air clutches. And I'm trying to let my pilot know that I was okay. I'm waving my arm in the air as much as I could. And then I hear air clutches right on top of me. And I thought, ain't that something? My dad's going to run over top of me. And another boat came up and pushed Dad out of the way because he didn't want Dad trying to run over me accidentally, not because he would be worried it was me. But no, sir, we didn't wear them. But if someone drowned, it was natural that we all, if we found the body, we put a life jacket on, uh, just so that their family got money. Uh, but we didn't wear them that much. Uh, they were they were cumbersome. But later, after I fell in the river, I kind of seen how it took falling in the river for my mind to accept them. Let's put it that way. Uh, and once I got in the wheelhouse, it was, a requirement, because I knew what would happen if you went in the water. And but we didn't wear them. The steel toes never did get popular, except for with the big boats, the line haul companies. But working in the harbor, nah, you know, a lot of people wore shorts. I didn't because I hated getting a burr cutting across my leg. Uh, but they wore shorts, no shirt. We had hellacious tans because we were out there. If we weren't on tow, we were working on the boat, and we all got great tans, and that's all coming back to get me now. With skin cancer. I had a doctor ask me, said, did you ever spend a lot of time in the sun? And I just laughed. I thought, you have no idea, lady. Uh, but it was different conditions than now. But also, by the time I started in the safety program at ACBL, there was 27 people that I'd worked with that had got killed out there. And Andy Canava had been at a master's meeting and someone had said something smart to me and I invited him to repeat it. And Andy called me at home right after I'd got home. He said, I hear you got in trouble. I said, so, I always do. And he said, uh, come on down here to Louisville. I need to talk to you. And I said, if you're going to fire me, do it. And he said, come down here to Louisville. So I drove back to Louisville. And he said, I got a job for you if you would do it. And I said, what is it? And he said, let's start a safety program, certifying the boats and trying to teach people. And we got it started. No one else in the industry did. And at the time we started that, there was a 14% incident rate, which that's per 100 hours is 1%. And we were at 14, the whole industry was at 14%. And Krause had the least incident rate. And Ingram was just a little bit more than what ACBL's was at the time. But Andy got me started doing this, and I would go out to the boats and Subchapter M and the AWO RCP, we were going to those meetings, and the stuff that was coming up, everyone was used to saying, go fly a kite. You're not going to tell me what to do on my boat. The office will talk to you. And it was going to catching the boats and sitting down with them. I'd spend 6 to 9 hours sitting there explaining why they needed this, not saying you have to do this, but saying why it's going to happen. And they would, well, always before someone from the office came out and talked to the Coast Guard. And I said, well, it ain't going to be that way anymore. You're going to have to answer for what you do or for what you haven't done. And talking to the crews and, getting them involved in it. And it took us about 7 years before we got the office, the safety program, the engineering, operations, all of that on the same page of going and doing stuff. But it was like we were three different places. It was us trying to teach safety, and engineering was over here. They weren't going to get involved. Operations is over here where that costs money. And it's I remember sitting with the lawyers one day and they were talking about how much money was being spent on new life jackets and all this. And I said, how much does, and I mentioned the accident that had happened. I said, how much did that cost you? And I said, that's more than that. More than what you paid in the whole year for this equipment. You paid out in one accident. And I can't remember the name of that lady that was lawyer at the time for us. She sat there and just kept looking at the papers, and finally she looked up and she said, well, maybe this safety stuff isn't that bad. And we started getting everyone on board then. And Ingram, jumped in. I think Tom Moore went over there and took our safety stuff with him. Uh, I took it to AEP. I was doing their books at the time. And Bob Taylor, he got in with AEP, getting them started on it. They had a very low incident rate to begin with. But everyone in the whole industry started getting on board. And I left ACBL and I went to work for another company for a little bit. And they came out on the boat and said, now these are the papers you got to do whenever you lay a boat up. You got to blah, 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 all this. And I said, yeah, I know. And they said, well, no, this is what we do. And I said, I know. And the guy said, well, how do you know? I said, look at the bottom of the page. That's my name and copyright. And he just kind of, wow, okay. And it made me feel good that what I had done was going around the company and all the different companies. Because if it saved one person from getting hurt, it was worth the 7 years of staying on the road catching boats. I'd catch boats for about 2 months, and I'd go home for a week and then go back get on my boat and then go catch boats for 2 weeks, then go home. I did that for 7 years. And uh, I learned as much as I taught, if you can understand that, because each boat was doing something. Might not have been what this one does, and it ain't wrong. And I learned a lot of stuff and took it back to my boat and showed it to my crew. I had a heck of a crew at the time. And I'd show it to them and say, see, and they would jump involved. And if you can make the crew think it's their idea, they will make sure anyone that gets on follows the rules because they think it's their rules. And like I said, I learned a lot in that safety program. And I'm pretty proud of what safety turned into industry wide. It, it, it used to be the least thought of thing with the industry. Back in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, that was not something that a company got involved in with safety. Uh, a person, you always heard the old saying, everyone's just a number. Well, that's actually what it was back there, Tim. Everyone was just a number. And that little fat man little fat Italian, Andy, he helped change this whole industry. And I was pretty proud to go with him. And he would call me every time he had a new program. And he called, wanted me to come to Baton Rouge for a program. And I said, Andy, I said, why? I said, every time you and I get together, I said, we end up in an argument. He said, yeah, we do. He said, but as long as you're there, you're going to tell me when I'm wrong. He said, everyone else is just going to sit there and wait for me to shut up. He said, if you're there, you open up your mouth. I said, well, yeah, I was told since I was a little kid I got a big mouth, so yeah, I'll do it. But Andy Canalva, I can't take credit for a lot. Andy Canalva helped this industry a lot, an awful lot. And I'm pretty proud that I worked with him.
What did any stories come to mind from your father from World War II forward or into the industry, or any sort of life lessons he learned out there that he shared with you over those years that have stuck with you?
Dad came home from the war with a huge chip on his shoulder. Uh, and he never sat down and talked to us about what had happened. He he kept it bottled up, and every once in a while it would come out. And I'd had to pull a guy out of a fire, and I was pretty shook up. And I was telling Dad about how whenever I got hold of him, his skin melted in my hands. And Dad said, yeah. He said, I've done that a lot. And I looked at him and I said, I know pretty well every incident that has happened to you out here. I said, when? And he said, they were on a sub during World War II, and they followed the Baton March. And overnight, they would sneak in life rafts and get the survivors or the carcasses. And he said he grabbed the guy's arm several different times, but he said one time he said he grabbed his arm and the guy moaned. And Dad looked down and his fingers were through the guy's skin, and where they had just marched him in the sun. And Dad, he was, that was part of it. You kept your reputation and what you did clean. You did not want to do something that other people looked down on. And you know who Pappy Borington was. You remember the show, uh, what was that show that they had on, the airplanes, Black Sheep, Baba Black Sheep. Oh, it was a series that was out for a while. Robert Conrad played the lead role. But anyway, that Dad and them picked him up out of the water 3 times. And the last 2 times that they got him, they had to lock him in the brig in the pantry till they got to Sydney to let him out, or the Midway, because he would steal everything in the boat. He'd go through all of their bunks. All they had was just stick their stuff underneath their mattresses. And Dad said he would steal everything on the boat. Uh, and then one day we were sitting there at home, and that Baa Black Sheep made its first showing. And Dad's sitting there looking at it, and he cut loose to cussing. He said, they're making a show about that guy. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, they are. And then he told us about, knowing him. Uh, but what Dad brought home from the service, he kept to himself his whole life. Uh, and it was underneath the skin his whole life. He never knew how to let it go. The stuff that he seen and did. And Dad was very prejudiced against any Oriental. Like all of them that came from the South Pacific during that time, they had a real grudge, you know, against them. and Dad was real bad with his. And I didn't understand it till I was a lot older, and he finally started telling a few things of what he saw. And it just made me sit back and go, wow, and you're my dad, uh, what he had had to do. But, he brought that stand up and do your job no matter what, back with him. And he carried it on through life, and he beat it in my head like an idiot, and I took hold of it. But that was, like I said, Dad taught me a lot. He was who taught me not the we didn't have AIS or any of that, but he taught me to look at the river and look at the radar and see how the radar runs around bends. And you knew how to make that bend where the deep water was going to be, where the shallow water was going to be. And as a little kid, he was teaching that to me, and it stuck in my head. Uh, and uh, like I said, towboating's the only daggone thing I know. Uh,
Well, do any stories or experiences of your father's from the river industry come to mind that he shared as you were coming up?
mhm. uh, he lost a good friend. Uh, and the guy had went down there at the Marine Repair Terminal there in Catlettsburg. The guy had went down in a barge, and it had been gas freed. And Dad had turned it around so they could weld on the other side. And when this guy went down inside the barge, uh, he struck his torch and it blew up. And Dad taught me, he was extremely upset over it. And it was to double check everything like that. Once he moved that barge, all that rust and stuff and build up on the sides of the barge inside, when he moved it, it loosened up and it allowed it to release chemical. And this, when the barge blew up, the guy ended up uh, about a city block away. Uh, it blew him out a cargo hatch. Uh, and, a lot of people way back then, it'd be cold, they'd climb down in a hatch to get out of the weather. And Dad taught me real young, nope, uh, don't get in the hatches. And it doesn't matter whether it was a coal barge or you don't know when that barge had had wheat or corn or something in it. And that was long before they started that gas ring and checking a barge for oxygen. You know, that didn't come into effect until the 90s. And a lot of people there weren't got out of barges because they went down in there trying to patch a hole and stuff and got overcome. That corn, those hoppers could have holes in them, that corn drop in and ferment. And the same way with the wheat. And you never knew whenever you were going to get kind of lightheaded in there, and that's what it would be. Uh, and there was so much. I know what you're asking me, Tim, but gosh, there was so much that I was taught that he showed me uh, about watching a boat. Like if you're going to have to downstream on a guy's toe, getting alongside of him and going staying even with that first coupling or cable and making sure that he's not moving ahead in the water. Because if there's a 6 mile an hour current and he's making a mile and a half hour ahead, that's going to make that trickier getting down. And some of the boats, are low stern and, they'd be going under the water. And he showed me how you could turn barges loose out in the current and run from one end to the other. You know, you get at the speed of the current. And he was making a trip, and we were meeting the Cotton Queen, going to swap tows with him down above Coney Island. And the guy on the Cotton Queen, you know, Dad knew, and Dad told him, said, just stop your tow and let it start going backwards, speed of the current. And he said, get her down to your face, to you one set of face wires. He said, when I tell you, turn loose and run for this one. And I thought that was pretty cool, swapping tows out in the middle of the river with current. And it made it so easy for that guy downstream because he didn't have any force on his back end, you know. And, you know, we went down the river about a half mile and we were both on each other's toe and going the other way then. Uh, and uh, the one thing Dad never taught me how to do is flank because he always had a boat that could drive out of it. And I was on a lot of pieces of junk that didn't have the power to back out. And I learned how to get with the current and let the current, you know, take me around. And I finally, one day, some guy said, oh, you flanked that. I said, is that what planking is? I said, that's the only way I could get the boat around, single screw. Uh, and he said, yeah, that's flanking. But I don't know any one particular thing that I could say that he didn't teach me, uh, and stories of what he did. Uh, we had 200 and some barges loose there in the harbor, and Dad had him catching them, and he had the Etna and the Allied in the harbor, and he had them catching them, and he told them to quit shoving on them, just go backwards, you know, and get down out of the harbor with them because stopping them right where the harbor was, that was going to block more water and make everything swifter around them. And just go down the river, and we would peel a string off and run tide off, and peel another string off, run tide off. And, you know, stuff like that was invaluable to me. You know, I learned to keep it in the back of my head, and there was times I learned how to use it. St. Louis came out, and they were trying to catch it and hold it, and it's like, don't hold it, let them go. You know, keep them off the other fleets. They're going to domino if you don't, and drop down out of the harbor, and then we'll catch them and bring them back. Uh, and you know, whenever I was doing that and it was coming out of my mouth, I thought, I sound like Paul Ball. And you know, that stuff, learning that, as long as you kept it up here, you didn't have to have it in the front of your mind, but as long as it was in the back of your mind and you remembered. And that was another thing he taught, was to remember. And as a kid, he had handed me a fleet diagram, and he'd give me the toe that was going out. And he would say, I only want to face up one time. So figure it out. And, you know, figuring out how to face up on what ones where he could move stuff and get them dug out to the outside and put them under and get the headers all the same way. And I learned that, you know, like I said, as a kid, it was a game, you know, at that time. But later on, when we were trying to get tows built for Crounce, and right after Ingram bought out OBL, you know, we had, I think, 500 barges in the fleet, and trying to get tows made up for them. And it was, like I said, so much what he taught me was invaluable, no matter how much I hated taking his orders. He taught a lot, and it made my life easier. You know, I'd never admitted it to him, but it made my life a lot easier.
Well, fill me in on your time ascending from deck to the wheelhouse. The first time at the sticks, things like that, getting posted in different rivers, and how much were you exposed to at first, and then I guess over the years, how did it branch out?
I remember stuff that when Dad had me on the boat when I was real little, but I hadn't been places. And I was working at Boggs's, and Murdy knew me since I was knee high, and he kept making me run a boat because he knew I could because I'd done it for Dad. And and then I wasn't getting the money I wanted, and I lied like a dog. Uh, and Amherst asked me if I could run the Ohio in the canal, and I said sure. And I could run them. I didn't really lie. I just hadn't been there. I'd been decking up on the canal a couple of times, and I would work for Amherst on my days off in the harbor up there at Canal Harbor or up at Leetard Island loading barges. And like I said, the way they phrased the question, yeah, I can run anywhere. And whenever I went to ACBL, it was the same thing. And Dad taught me how to read a map and how to read uh, a radar. And then I spent a lot of times off watch standing up looking out the front window in my room to watch how people did stuff. And at ACBL back then, I was afraid to ask for help because it was so much by some of calling in and say, well, this guy doesn't know anything. I had to help him. So I wouldn't ask a lot of people for help, if I didn't know something. But I burnt that water column up with friends of mine that I had grown up with. Paul Boggs was one, Steve Kimberlin, uh, Bruce Rowe. I would call them up and da 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 da, what do I do? And they would say, well, you know, watch for this, watch for that. You'll have a set here, set there. And I got turned loose from St. Louis to Cairo with 30 barges. And I'd never been there with one barge. And it wasn't easy. I never had to back up and hide. But Tim, I pulled a lot of hair out in that trip from St. Louis to Cairo. And pretty good. I'm glad it was high water because I shortcutted a lot of stuff that if it would have been normal water, I would have run over top of Point. But whenever I made that turn, I didn't know how to make the turn at Cairo. And I thought, well, all those years coming out of Sandy River, I turned up to Ohio. It's got to be something close. And I ended up clear down by the boat store before I ever got them turned around. But uh, it was when I got to the fleet and I got off watch, I went down there and I didn't get my clothes off. I just fell across the bed and died because I hadn't slept since we left St. Louis. Uh, what I didn't catch myself, I was watching this other guy catch uh, and seeing how he did it. And I stole a chart book and had it down in my room where I was watching uh, everything as we came out. And uh, I am not saying I never made mistakes. God, I made a bunch of them. But I learned something that Captain Murdy Boggs always said. If you mess up, you better remember why you messed up and how you got yourself out of it. And I messed up a lot. Knock on wood, I never had a recordable accident, uh, which for 42 years standing in the forward watch, that's pretty good, uh, or at least I think it is. I'll pat myself on the back for it anyway. Uh, but
What do you think about the industry today? How, what all it takes, all the regulations, everything that is going on these days.
the regulations were needed. Uh, as hard as what they are, the first have to follow and learn. They were put in place for a reason. Some of them are overboard, but we fought so daggone hard to keep OSHA from getting a toehold in this industry. And if OSHA would have got into this industry, they would have shut it down. And we fought hard. I remember I was at a AWO and RCP meeting, the two of them together down at Memphis. And OSHA was in there, and they were just sitting there. And everyone was like, oh my God, they're going to want to get involved. And after, we finished, they said, well, you guys are doing what ought to be done. We don't need to bother you all. And they went out the door, and there was probably 20 of us in there, and we went, we dodged the bullet there and got them out of there. Uh, but a lot of it's needed. Uh, you don't have experience out there, Tim, like there was all the years before. And all of that stuff the old timers knew has been lost. Uh, and a lot of these kids that are in there, and I say kids because of what my age is, but they don't understand. They run by the AIS and they don't stay up and try to learn. I had so many of them on the boat, and I would tell them, I say, you might want to watch this. And no, I don't care. I don't care. Uh, and I remember one of them, I was trying to talk to him about how to make Cincinnati bridges. And he was sitting there, picked up his phone and started playing a video game. And I'm like, why am I wasting my time? Uh, and I heard later on, uh, he caught the Southern Railroad Bridge. Didn't do a lot of damage, but he caught Southern Railroad Bridge. And I thought if you would have listened, maybe, you could have avoided that one. But the regulations, I'm in favor of them. And it's like any new rule, they're a pain in the butt when you first have them. But the people coming up with you, if they start out having to do them, then they're not hard because it's part of the job. It has been all along. It's us older people that had problems with the regulations because we'd already been doing that. We don't need that. We already know what we're supposed to be doing, but we don't. And that's why a lot of I started a lot of stuff that was check sheets, and the Coast Guard got on and they asked me one day where my check sheet was for something. And I said, we don't use them. And they said, well, we do. And I thought, well, yeah, you do. So, I started making them up for my boat and anyone else that wanted them. And it just it was what developed into the vessel check and the yawl check and all of that as it went on with it. Uh, and all those new things are only a pain when you first start them. After you've been doing them, they're just rote. It's, routine and it's not, but every time something new comes out, people were complaining because it's new. Uh, but that same guy that's just starting right beside you, it's not a pain to him because he's just started and that's what is sitting there in front of him. And teaching people not to downgrade what is coming up until they have had a chance to review it. Because I don't know how much you've been around a lot of old towboaters, but the first thing out of their mouth is, I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't need. Well, we do, because that person standing beside you needs. And I had to go catch a vessel one time. I'd working out of Cairo, and uh, a boat had had an accident, and they run me out to it. They wanted me to get on there before the Coast Guard did to play, mediator between them. And I got on there, and this guy started cussing me for coming on his boat. I said, the office sent me. He said, I've been doing this for I don't know how many years. He said, I don't need someone to tell me what to do. I said, well, what happened coming around to get out of shape? He said, I've made this for X amount of years the same way every time, and I'll continue to do it. I said, well, this time didn't work. And he said, well, get off my boat. I said, your boat? Yes, sir, I'll leave. And the Coast Guard got on, and he was stupid enough to say that same thing to the Coast Guard. And they took his license for 6 months. And the office jumped all over me, said, we sent you out there to be a mediator. I said, talk to him. You know, I told him what he said to me, and they picked up the Coast Guard's report and said, well, he said the same thing to them. And said we lost the captain for 6 months. And because they just wrote it out and they didn't have to go to court. It was just, their write out on the guy. But, I've been doing stuff for 42 years, and doesn't mean I don't pay attention. I always knew sooner or later something was going to happen. And I always wanted to make sure I did it every time like I was supposed to. Paul Boggs was talking about, I was on a boat with him, and I'd known Paul since I was a little tiny kid. He was decking there at Boggs's for Clarence. And I, I respected Paul Boggs so much. And he was talking about making Louisville bridges. And he said, told me how he made them. And I said, okay. He said, every time you come down, he said, you get yourself in that position. He said, you start doing it way up here, getting yourself in position. He said, and you make that canal the same way every time. He said, and that way, if you're out of shape, he said, you know it immediately because it's not the same thing you've been doing. And the same thing with Cincinnati bridges. Make them the same way. St. Louis bridges. Make them the same way each time. And if you're out of shape, your mind picks it up immediately. And people like that influenced me in my career. And I love old Paul to death. Steve Kimberlin the same way. I've known them since they were little kids working in the harbor. But a lot of old people don't. Old people, as in myself, uh, they revolt something new. But it's not something new, it's just reinforcing what you were taught to do. Uh, if that makes sense. But I'm just a yakking away. You got me on a spree, Tim.
We're coming up around an hour. Won't be too much longer here, I don't think. But what do you expect that you've stepped off a boat for the last time as a pilot?
No.
How many more
If
years
they
do you?
get my back surgery done
Mhm.
to where I'm not taking those medications, I'll be back.
How many more years do you expect to be playing out there?
Well, I had an old captain tell me one time he was going to work till he died. So those daggone deckhands had to carry his something something ass off the boat. Uh, that's what my feelings are. I'll stay till I die, uh, just so that that deckhand that cusses me has to carry me down the steps and off the boat. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I don't know, Tim. As long as I have my wits about me, uh, I will work. Uh, and that's why I'm trying to do this investigation stuff, just so I stay involved, because I don't feel good not being involved. Uh,
And with all that in mind, what sort of legacy do you hope to leave behind on the industry here?
if I kept one person from getting hurt, everything I did was worth it. You know, I don't have to know the person that I kept from getting hurt, but just that I kept someone from getting hurt. Uh, when I was real sick, I had a liver transplant. My liver exploded on the boat, and I laid for 3 years waiting for a donor. And I kept getting a message on Facebook or on my phone from a guy and asking how I was doing and everything. And I went in, I got the transplant, and it was afterwards. And, when I was in my healing stage. And this guy just kept messaging me, asking how I was coming along and everything. Finally, instead of messaging back, I dialed him up. And I said, I appreciate you checking on me like you have done. I said, but who are you? He said, oh, we've never met. And I said, we've never met. He said, no. He said, you've had such an influence on my career. And I said, I'm flabbergasted. How? If we've never met? He said, my uncle, he said, I would call him about something. And he would say, well, this is what Rusty Ball would do. And he'd say, this is what Rusty Ball said about coming around down on those bridges on what was going to affect you. And I said, who was your uncle? And he told me who his uncle was. And it was not a close friend of mine or anything. And I broke down into tears. It humbled me so much. And I didn't know the guy. And he said that I had influenced his career that much. Uh, that was the best healing agent medicine that I could get. But my wife came over where I was sitting and she said, what is the matter? What's, what's wrong? And I couldn't answer her for crying. That humbled me so much. That right there is enough to make everything I did in my career worthwhile. Because if I influenced one, I had to influence more. Uh, and all of my handling the cruise, I got from my dad, from Max English, uh, Gene Dent, all those old timers at Ashland. Uh, they all did it different. And they taught me everyone is different. You have to find that one little thing that makes them wake up and do what they want. I have a guy that is one of my best friends now, and so many people passed him around, didn't want him on the boat. He was hard headed, blah, blah, blah. And I got him on the boat with me. And there was something that I just clicked in my head about him. And I told him, I said, this is the job I want done. I said, I'm relying on you to do it. It's up to you to do the job. And instead of telling him he had to go do something, I put it in his lap for him. And he ended up being one of the best mates I ever had. And he kept the boat clean. He made the crews do what they were supposed to do. He was a heck of a worker. But everyone is handled different. There's different instigators for people. There's a lot of them you have to scream it in their ear. And some of them, I had a kid come up one day and he had a pad and a pencil. He said, "You just write down everything you want done." And I took the pad and pencil and threw it out the window. And I said, "Just go listen to your mate." Uh, but everyone is different. You're different. You would learn how to run a boat and do stuff different than me, and I would learn different from you. I wouldn't, what you're doing, dispatching, it'd take me my mind so long to try to figure it out and know what you do. But you've got other dispatchers that do the same job, but they do it different than you. But that's the same thing with the river industry.
Well, sir, thank you for your contributions to the industry, for your time today. That's as good a place to stop as any, I think. Do you have anything else to add about anything else?
Yeah, everyone, be safe, be cautious, and remember you have to be accountable for your actions and your not actions, and play safe. Uh, and that's pretty well it. Play safe.